We often are so busy, we neglect how we feel. We sometimes I'm guilty of it too. I'll be working and I have to go to the bathroom and I don't even go to the bathroom. I'm invalidating how I feel. And I recently gave a talk to a group of high powered women and I asked them, how many of you have worked through going to the bathroom through eating? And they raised their hands because we don't acknowledge how we feel. If you don't acknowledge how you feel, you can't do anything about it.
How on earth does validating how I feel make me happier?
Knowing how you feel in itself is a therapeutic act. Many times we don't understand our emotions. We kind of feel like blah, numb, or we're just going through it. But the science shows us that if we can acknowledge how we feel, that in itself decreases the amount of uncertainty. As human beings, we need to know things. Feeling that we know what's happening actually decreases uncertainty and decreases stress, and we feel better.
So how do you start this? Because I think for a lot of us, if I think back to today, I'm doing okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like this particular day. Tomorrow, who knows what's going to happen when I wake up. But when I think back to moments in my life where I've been profoundly unhappy, I was way too busy. I was drinking too much. I was gaslighting myself, saying, I'll just get through it. I'll just get through it. But if you're in the middle of that, or you're profoundly depressed, like you're so wired to just keep going or to avoid it, how do you even validate your feelings if you've basically been numbing them for a long time?
So many times we avoid how we feel because this is a trauma response. If bad things happen to us and they're emotionally triggering, we don't want to think about it. So it's natural to not want to say, I feel this way, because we're afraid that if we acknowledge it, something bad will happen. And we get triggered and we may go into fight or flight because we're acknowledging this negative emotion. But it's important to do this because if we are not acknowledging how we're feeling, we're not able to break patterns that may actually be very unhealthy for us. I once had a client who had a hard time validating how she felt because she was so busy, focused on everyone else around her. She was busying herself, worried about how everyone else felt and validating them, that she was invalidating herself. And in our work together, we realized that she was the serial people pleaser. But in that work, having her slow down, having her not look outwards, but look inwards and understand that, okay, I'm doing this because I have low self-worth, because, in my past, I was neglected, that this is the only way that I can show up because this is the only way I think I'm able to obtain love. That allowed her to acknowledge that emptiness that she felt, that feeling of low worth that she felt. And it wasn't a positive feeling. It was a negative feeling. It was painful for her. But acknowledging it and validating it allowed us to do the work to move forward in a different direction so that her relationships are more balanced and they're healthier.
A lot of times when you are a people pleaser and you are somebody that cannot say no and you struggle with guilt and then you're exhausted and you're always last on the list, like there's this real kind of weakness that masochism is a strong word. And so when you start to call yourself, I'm being a masochist, which basically means you're destroying yourself, if I'm kind of tracking with you here. You had the benefit of going to therapy. The majority of people do not. So do you, as a psychiatrist running a clinical practice, have a tricky question, like a sneaky one? First, no, I'm serious. The act of learning how to validate how you feel, it's very difficult for a lot of people. I remember this funny thing that my mother said once. We were talking about therapy, and she just kind of quipped, well, why would I want to go to therapy? So I can find out I hate my life and I don't like your father? Like, I don't want to look at myself. And we had a good laugh, and she was kind of kidding. But is there a way, and I really mean this, for somebody that's never stopped to think about how they're actually feeling because they've been in survival mode or they've had an experience in life where they've just felt kind of invisible, where you could give the person listening a cue or a journal prompt so that they could truly do step one?
Absolutely. And you're going to say it's simple, but the first step is ask yourself, how do I feel? I know it sounds so cheesy, but how do I really feel? That's like the internal validation. People are neurodivergent. Some people can't do that introspection. connection. So what I do with some of my clients is I say, well, because you're a visual learner, sometimes it's helpful for you, may not be helpful for someone else, to look in the mirror and look yourself in the eye and say, how am I feeling today? And be honest with yourself. Other people, again, people learn differently. They're more tactile, so they use their hands, they're more manual. So I'll ask them to write, how do I feel? In some cases where people have something called alexithymia, which is a condition where you have a really hard time pinpointing your emotions, I'll actually have a face chart of different emotions and different words, and I'll ask them to circle, how do I feel? It sounds very basic, but there are people who can't. They just either culturally were not taught to validate themselves, or in their family, it just wasn't the norm. Or again, they have alexithymia, they just don't know how to identify feelings. So depending on the person, I have artists sometimes who come to my office and I'll say, like, when you're playing a song, maybe play a song that expresses how you feel. So that's how you can self-validate. You can verbally acknowledge it or you can write it down, but it's important to do it.
I think I understand why. Let me give this back to you. You can't be sober until you stop drinking. And if you want to be happy, you're not going to be able to access it if you are going through life denying the fact that you feel overwhelmed or sad or lonely. Like, stopping to acknowledge where you're at opens the door for you to walk through it into a different room.
Yes.
So what is the second V?
The second V is venting. And
I love this one. Okay.
If you think about venting, so from the scientific term, it's like air is in a bubble and then you let it out and the pressure is released. We need to let out our pressure. We need to let off steam, literally, right? So venting is getting that, like, once you validate how you feel, how do you get it out there? For some people, I mean, my dad's a pastor. They pray. You know, in the church, a lot of people pray and they'll talk to God and they express to God how they're feeling, but they don't feel comfortable telling their partner. They don't feel comfortable telling anyone else. For others, it's talking to a therapist. For others, it could be to a faith leader. And I mentioned I treat artists. So sometimes some of my artists will come in and they'll sing a song to me or they'll show me something that they drew. I personally vent by using social media, because if I'm feeling a certain way, I'll create a reel or, a post to express it. And a lot of my younger clients who are in Gen Z, like, I think now 50% of Gen Z wants to have like a side hustle as being an influencer. So they're expressing their feelings that way, venting in that creative outlet.
So let me just make sure I get venting. Because when you said the second V from the research that you've been doing on what you need to be doing in order to become happier based on the research, when you said venting, I'm like, great. So my rage texts to my husband are going to make me happier. But that's not what you mean. Okay.
Well, there are do's and don'ts of venting.
Okay.
Right?
So give us the do's, because if you validate how you feel, which opens the door to having you be able to feel something different, then you have to vent. But what am I venting exactly? Am I venting bad things? Am I venting good things?
You can vent bad or good. Venting is getting the emotion out once you acknowledge it.
Oh.
Validating can be acknowledging both perceived good and bad emotions, right? Negative or positive. I don't like the word good, bad, but any emotion that you acknowledge, you can then vent it. Now, what you described when you are, full of rage or you're emotional, that could be perceived as trauma dumping, right? So,
you mean Thursday night?
And with my clients, I do go through the do's and the don'ts. Like, don't vent when you're in the heat of the moment, right? Maybe take a beat, slow down a bit and think about it. And then, don't trauma dump, especially if you're venting to someone who's maybe someone who's an employee, right? That power dynamic is not fair, because they're going to listen. They're not going to be like, shut up. Like, you complain all the time. They're going to be like, yeah, boss. And then they're going to go home and then they're going to vent to someone else, right? So you want to be mindful of making sure that you're not trauma dumping and making sure that you are reflecting and not, then creating stress for someone else. But really, I ask people to do a lot of self-venting first. So say it out loud if you have to, express it in a song if you have to. But it is helpful to talk to people. And you want to think about, okay, the person that I'm going to repeatedly, is it fair? is that person okay with it? So you can even ask them like, hey, is it okay if I check in with you? I have this problem. I know that I come to you often. If it ever feels like I'm doing this too much or you feel overwhelmed and it's not reciprocal, let me know. So there are ways to go about it, which I provide.
So as part of the 5 V's, and I'm sorry, I've like got my little brain spinning here. Are part of these 5 V's helping you also release the things that are keeping you unhappy?
Yes.
Got it. Okay. So now I'm getting this. So a lot of people that do happiness research, they start with do these things, and then that creates more happiness. As a clinical researcher, you're saying there are actually things that are in your way from even accessing the advice that a lot of people are giving. That if you're, let's just take the first one, not even present to your feelings and you haven't validated them, you're not going to take the walk. If you're not venting, which now it sounds like venting is literally releasing the emotion that has you trapped, whether it's positive or negative, and saying, oh, I'm sad, and or talking to somebody or doing art, you're going to stay stuck in that emotion because it's trapped in you. And so it's almost like these are hidden obstacles that are keeping you from accessing the happiness that's available to you.
Everyone has a different idea about happiness, but many people, when they think of happiness, they're thinking about, I have this house, I have this car, I have this partner, I have this perfect job, I feel complete. Once you get those things, the science shows that you're still not happy, you're still looking for more things.